Hi, this is Craig Stocks here at Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And this is part 2 of a 2-part video. Part 1, I went through the Lagoon Nebula in PixInsight. And when we ended up, we had saved these 5 files, actually 6 files. The RGB starless image, sulfur, oxygen, and hydrogen, as well as the RGB stars, and we also saved the oxygen stars. So now we'll go into Photoshop and have some fun. So let's get started in Photoshop. Let me close this image that I used as a preview, and we're going to, like we always do, we want to load all of those files as layers in Photoshop so that we can work with them and create one image out of all of those layers. So we'll go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack, and that brings up this dialog box where we can choose what files we want to load. So we'll browse for the files, and those are going to be where we just saved them under the Lagoon for gem. And here are sulfur, hydrogen, oxygen, and the stars. Let's see. Notice remember I mentioned sometimes I don't get them all saved. Notice I did not get the sulfur starless image saved. I've got oxygen, hydrogen, and the oxygen stars. I wondered why I got a message that that file already existed, and that's why I don't close the files until I'm sure I'm done. So let's hop back over to PixInsight, and this is the sulfur image that didn't get saved. So we'll just do a quick file, save as, and navigate to the correct folder. Select TIFF in 16-bit. Now we should have everything there, and there's our sulfur now has been added to the list of files. I'll click OK, and it'll list the files. I could click Browse and add more files to the list if I wanted to, or I can just click OK, and it will load those files now as layers in one Photoshop document. And that's exactly what we want so that we can work with the different files as layers. So as always, the first thing we need to do is start with a little housekeeping. And I like to put every one of these layers in its own group, and then I'll put them in a specific order. So we're going to start with the RGB since it happens to be on top. Now the easiest way to put a layer into a group is to select the layer or layers that you want, and just use the keyboard shortcut Control G on Windows or Command G on a Mac, and that will create a group with the selected layers in the group. Now I can double click on the group name and change the name to RGB, and I'm just going to drag this down to the bottom for now for safekeeping. So here's our stars image, and here's our oxygen stars. So I'm going to select both by clicking on one and then shift clicking on the other one, and then again Control G. This is stars, and let's go ahead and add some adjustment layers. I know I almost always will use a levels adjustment layer, and I can use that to make stars bigger or smaller. And I'll almost always add a hue saturation, and I will typically increase the saturation globally and then click on the red and decrease the saturation again of the red stars, and that gives us a more natural look. And we'll just leave this for now. Here is our hydrogen, so Control G, change the name to hydrogen, and we'll add a levels adjustment layer, and then we're going to want to colorize this, and to do that we're going to use hue saturation. So from my adjustments panel I can choose hue saturation, and I want to colorize this, so I'll click on colorize. I'm going to drag the brightness to -50. I want to take the saturation to 100%. And since this is hydrogen, we want it to be green. So that's going to be a hue rotation angle of 120 degrees. And that'll give us a pure green. Now, we may wind up modifying that a little bit, but I usually like to start with it pretty precisely set. So there's our hydrogen mapped as green, which is what you would do with SHO. And I'll just turn that off for now, and we'll do the same thing with oxygen. I'll add a levels adjustment layer, add a hue saturation, colorize, -50, 100%, and we want this to be blue, which is 240. There we go. And we'll just collapse that layer group and turn it off. Go to sulfur. And notice when a layer group is open and I add an adjustment layer with the layer group name selected, it'll add this adjustment layer inside the group. If I add another adjustment layer now, the normal behavior is it'll add it on top of whatever is the current selected layer. And now we want to, again, colorize, -50, 100%, and this is going to be red, so that's a hue rotation angle of 0. And we'll just turn that off. So here's our RGB image, and let's go ahead and add a levels adjustment layer in here. And if we want to play with the brightness of this, if we want to brighten the background or darken the background, darken the midtones and brighten the background, I mean, you can work with this however you want. And this is where you start getting into photo processing rather than astronomical data processing. So you have much more artistic license now than you would have typically working in PixInsight especially if you're doing something like spectroscopy or something scientific. Once you start stretching the individual channels, you've basically lost your connection to the scientific data, and you're getting into the realm of art and art that can be used to illustrate scientific principles, but you can't really do scientific comparisons from it. If we want to adjust the color balance, we might add a color balance layer here and play around with more or less red. I think actually a little bit less red, maybe adding a little blue, a little magenta. If we want to increase the color saturation, we can add a hue saturation adjustment layer. And notice that I keep adding adjustment layers. I never want to adjust the base layer where the pixels are. I want to keep that as pristine as it came from PixInsight, with just a few exceptions. Most everything else I want to do with an adjustment layer, because then it's non-destructive. Applying these adjustment layers doesn't change the base layer, it just changes the look of the base layer. If I want to put the stars on it, I can just turn the stars layer on. And the stars, like all layer groups or all layers, by default are in normal, or if it's a layer group, the default is pass-through blending mode. And we want to put the stars in a special blending mode called screen, which I can get through by clicking on pass-through. And in screen blending mode, anything that's black is transparent. Anything that's lighter than black gets added to what's below. And when we removed the stars, we used a process called unscreen. So the proper way to put the stars back in is through the screen blending mode. And that gives you a real nice natural look. By virtue of having them on a separate layer or in separate layer groups, I can come to this levels adjustment layer and I can adjust the brightness and therefore the size of the stars without affecting the nebula in the background. So if I want stars to be more visible, less visible, if I want more or less color saturation, I can do that. Now I also saved, if you recall, the oxygen stars. And these are the oxygen stars, and I liked them because they were nice and tight and small, and they don't take away from the nebula at all. The problem is the narrowband data is all monochrome because this was all captured with a monochrome camera. So in order to have the best of both worlds, if I want the color from the color stars and the size and detail from the oxygen stars, I can do that by arranging the layers so that the oxygen stars are at the bottom of this stars layer group. And then I put the color RGB stars on top of it. But just like we used screen blending mode for the group, there are lots of blending modes, and the one I want to use to get just the color from the stars would be the color blending mode. So now we have stars that are the natural correct color based on spectrophotometric color calibration, but they're nice and small because we're using the narrowband oxygen stars. So that's a trick you can use, or a technique you can use to manage star size in narrowband images. Still get the natural RGB colors, but not have to minimize the stars using other tools or filters. And then again, we still have our levels adjustment layer, so we can adjust the size of the stars. And I think that looks pretty good right there. So now we have an RGB image. I usually will apply a set of global adjustments, and the global adjustments I want to be, let me collapse all the layer groups. So these are all layer groups, and I have RGB on the bottom, then sulfur, oxygen, hydrogen, and above the hydrogen but below the stars I want to add some global adjustments. So with the hydrogen layer group collapsed, if I click on levels, that will add a levels adjustment layer. And then typically there would be a color balance, a hue saturation, and then last would be my solid color fill layer, which I have to get to using this little black and white yin-yang symbol at the lower right. And I'll choose solid color. And the solid color I want is RGB values of 19, 19, 19. And I can get to that by typing 13, 13, 13 in this hexadecimal field, and that gives me 19s for RGB. Click OK, and as I said, the default blending mode is normal. And what I want this to do, it's a very dark gray, not quite black, and I want it to brighten anything that's darker than this. So in other words, I don't want any tones darker than 19, 19, 19, because if there are, they're probably just noisy. So I'm going to put this layer in lighten blending mode, and it probably isn't having any effect right now, other than maybe some very local details. And as I turn it on and off, I'm not really seeing any place it's having an effect. So what I can do is come to my levels adjustment and use the black slider to darken the blacks, and at some point that will start to darken things below that 19, 19, 19. And that's about, okay, now we're starting to see. If I turn it on and off, look over here on the left hand side, you can see we're starting to clip some color data. So I know now that that's too dark, because I don't want to have that much of an effect. I want to have just a, if anything, just a barely visible effect. So I'm going to lighten the darks back up a little bit to keep those above that 1919 layer. So look, right here we have a very nice RGB image. Let's play around a little bit with some of the narrowband data, because right now all of the sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen is turned off. So I'm going to take these 4 global adjustment layers, and I'm going to select all 4, Control G, put them in a group, and name it global. And just to be able to see everything we're doing, I'm going to turn off the stars and the global adjustments, and I'm even going to turn off the RGB, and now we see the Photoshop's checkerboard pattern that indicates transparent, and that's because we don't have anything turned on right now. So let's turn on sulfur first, and we can see that it's color mapped red. If I turn on oxygen, it's blue, and it completely overlays the red. It just replaces it. And we want to be able to see through these. So again, I'm going to use the screen blending mode, and that will combine. So now we have sulfur in red and oxygen in blue. If I come up to the hydrogen, turn it on, and again put it in screen blending mode, now we have an SHO image. The colors aren't especially pleasing, but we have an SHO image. We can adjust the colors a couple different ways. Typically, my first pass at adjusting the color is going to be by adjusting the brightness of the individual sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen layer groups. I tell you what, before we jump into SHO, let's do an HOO. And to do that, I'm going to turn off the sulfur layer. And now we have hydrogen is green and oxygen is blue. If you remember, HOO, we wanted hydrogen to be red and oxygen to be cyan, or green and blue. So let's just open those two layer groups, and we'll go to the hue saturation for hydrogen, and here's the properties of that selected adjustment layer. Excuse me. Right now it's color mapped as green. If I want it to color map it as red, I just slide this over, and now we have hydrogen is color mapped as red. If I go to oxygen, it's color mapped as blue. If I just drag it back over to cyan, and I can even choose the cyan that I want visually, but it's going to be about halfway between 120 and 240, which would be 180. I'm actually at 190, so I'm a little bit bluer than pure cyan. And that gives us a nice HOO image. And if I go to my global adjustments, and at this point I might want to fine-tune color, contrast, saturation, I can turn the stars on, and now we have an HOO image with RGB stars, but using the sizes of the stars from the oxygen data. So there's an HOO image, and if we want to compare that, let me collapse these. This was our RGB image. This is our HOO image. So as I said, it tends to color map pretty well to the same as natural color with most nebulae. So let's go back to an SHO image. So to do that, I need to take my hydrogen back to green, which is 120. We need to take our oxygen back to blue, which is going to be 240. And turn the sulfur back on, which is red. Now, one thing I do a lot of times, we have this RGB data down here at the bottom, and there's no reason we can't use that to kind of boost some of the detail and color and presence in the image. So right now our sulfur is the bottom narrowband layer, and it's in pass-through blending mode. So I'm going to change it to screen blending mode also, and that doesn't have an effect because there's nothing turned on below it. But if I turn on our RGB layer, we now have an RGB image with an SHO image overlaid on top of it. And if we go to our brightness or levels adjustment for the RGB image, in fact I'm going to add another levels adjustment and keep this one just for this blended mode. If I reduce the brightness of the RGB image, we can have it have more or less effect. I can also come up to the global levels adjustment and adjust the image there. So a lot of times I will use an RGB image or even an HOO image underneath the narrowband data. So that's another technique you can use. If we stick with just the SHO data, and again, I'm going to turn off the global and the stars because I want to try to get the color balance as pleasing as I can to start with. Most images come out too green because hydrogen is very dominant. There's a couple different ways we can deal with that. One is we can go to the hydrogen and go to the levels adjustment layer, and by just making the hydrogen darker, that lets more of those other colors shine through. And that's a pretty big improvement right there. I can also, if I want to bring out more red, which is typically what you want, I'll start with the sulfur, and I'll go to the levels adjustment, which is basically adjusting the brightness of the sulfur, or whatever level, whatever group that is, and I'll increase the brightness of the reds, and I might even slide the white slider a little bit. I don't want to blow out the detail here. Sometimes you start getting too much red in the black areas, so you might have to dial it back a little bit with the black slider. And let's go to the oxygen, and again we probably want to make our oxygen a little bit brighter, and we're starting to get some blue in the background, so I'm going to darken the blacks. What that's doing is when I darken the blacks in the oxygen group, which is contributing blue to the image, what I'm doing is taking blue out of the black areas. So I'm increasing the brightness of the blue in the midtones, taking some out in the black areas. We can play with the brightness of our hydrogen now. That usually you want a little bit of the, some of the yellow, sometimes even green. It doesn't look bad. But this image is pretty dark, but it has a lot of, to me it has a lot of dimension to it. It looks three-dimensional. And we can come to our global adjustments. And adjust the global adjustments. Now at this point, I've already done what I think is a pretty good job color balancing. I might come back, and it's still SHO, but hydrogen and oxygen in particular, I might adjust the actual color. So instead of pure green, if I move the the hydrogen towards cyan, we can take some of that green away, or if we move it towards the orange, we can make it a little more reddish. And this is, I'm really just adjusting this visually to what I think looks good, trying to find a pleasing color balance. I think I'm going to boost the reds a little bit more, which is in the sulfur. And what happens when I turning on the RGB layer, I really like what it does in the around the perimeter. I don't like what it does in the core. So I'm going to darken it a little bit, and I'm focusing primarily around the outskirts here, because it's adding some nice texture and color, but the center is getting too bright. So I'm going to use a layer mask, and I'm going to mask out this RGB layer, which would be the equivalent of turning it off. And I'm going to mask it in this central area where it's making the image too bright. So right now the layer group does not have a mask, so I'll come to the circle in a square. It kind of looks like a front-loading washer, and we'll add a layer mask, and we can see it now as the white thumbnail. And with the mask itself targeted, you can see there's a little outline around the mask. I'll grab my brush tool and tap the D key to get my default colors, which gives me white as the foreground. And to mask something out and make it invisible, I want to paint with black on a mask, because black on a mask hides. So I'll tap X, and now we have black as our foreground color. And I'm going to go ahead and just move this opacity up to 100%. And I'll use the right bracket key to make the brush bigger. And when I paint with black on this mask, it's going to hide this RGB layer, just like that. And you can see on the layer thumbnail the outline of that black that I just painted. And now we'll come to our global adjustments, and we might tweak this a little bit. I'll say something like that. I'm going to boost the global saturation a little bit, and I may even target just the reds and change the color hue of the reds to make it a little deeper red. And then I might target the yellows and boost them a little bit. And we're not getting much in the way of yellows, so I may come back to the hydrogen, and if I boost the midpoint of hydrogen, that's going to put more green and yellow into the image. And when I do that, it looks good, except the oxygen starts to get a little cyan, so I'll come back to the oxygen and adjust its color back towards the blue. And that's starting to look, I think, pretty good. And we can always turn the stars on and see how it looks. So that is with the RGB color on oxygen stars. Right now the RGB stars are in color blending mode. If I put it back in normal blending mode, that's what it looked like with the native RGB stars. So now it's a matter of taste. I could use the RGB stars and maybe diminish them a little bit. Or I can use the oxygen stars with the RGB color. And this is probably a pretty good place to stop. We've gone through a couple different variations. We looked at RGB, HO, SHO, and even though this is an SHO image, we're still getting pretty natural looking colors because of the way we've color mapped and managed the sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen. If we want to continue to adjust it, we can always, at this point, we can use the global adjustment, for instance, the color balance and the global hue saturation to fine-tune the look of the image. If we want to adjust the stars, again, they're on a separate layer in a layer group. At this point, I would save this image as a large document format, and that would be under File, Save As, and you want to be sure to choose Large Document Format, which is a PSB file, and that will save it with all of these layers intact. And I'll save that in my 2025 Photos folder. And that's it. So I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, be sure to drop those in the comments down below. And if you like content like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and that way you'll be notified when I issue a new video tutorial. And as always, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.